Welcome to Understanding China, the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation series dedicated to helping Americans better understand the nature of the People's Republic of China, the Chinese Communist Party, and key issues in U.S. China relations. I'm Murray Bissett, Director of Academic Programs, and I'm pleased to present to you today Dr. Michael Auslin, the Payson J. Treat Distinguished Research Fellow in Contemporary Asia at the Hoover Institution of Stanford University, who specializes in U.S. policy in Asia and geopolitical issues in the Indo-Pacific region. Misha's latest book, Asia's New Geopolitics, Essays on Reshaping the Indo-Pacific, is now available in hardcover and Kindle. He is also the author of the best-selling The End of the Asian Century, War, Stagnation, and the Risks to the World's Most Dynamic Region, among others. His list of previous achievements, affiliations, and awards is long and distinguished. Likely of interest to our attendees, and certainly relevant to our conversation today, Misha co-hosts the Pacific Century podcast with John Yoo, where they discuss politics, economics, law, and cultural news, with a focus on U.S. policy in China and Asia. During today's event, Accountability and Reciprocity in U.S. China Relations, Misha will help us to understand the current state of U.S.-China relations and of U.S. government policy and actions in the region. We are truly privileged to have Misha here with us to share his unparalleled knowledge of the current state of play in the Indo-Pacific. Today's event will take the form of a conversation shaped by the questions of our audience. As such, I encourage attendees to submit questions for Misha throughout the event, basically starting right now, using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And with that, Misha, welcome. We're very happy that you're here with us. And to kick things off, I have a rather large question, or rather a series of large questions, to be honest. What is the state of U.S.-China relations? Are we in a new Cold War? Where does current U.S. government policy stand? Is there a unity of purpose between the legislative and executive branches with respect to China? Does the Trump administration have a strategy? And finally, what principles underlie this strategy, and what specifically is the place of accountability and reciprocity?
Well, Murray, first of all, thank you very much for having me today. It's always a pleasure to be with the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. The work that you all do is so incredibly important, not only historical memory, but warning about the communism that we face today, which is something that unfortunately people seem to often have forgotten, that there are still communist regimes and those that believe in the tenets of communism. So the work that you do, that Marion does, it's truly important. And unfortunately, it's actually becoming more important. And there's probably no better example of that than China. So I'm very happy to be here to talk with you today about this, and with everyone who's tuning in. That was a very long list of questions. I probably should have written them all down, but it starts us off, I think, in the right direction, which is to ask, in essence, how did we get here? Why are we at a point where we're talking about a new Cold War? Why are we talking about the possibility, if you look at the South China Sea, potentially of conflict between the United States and China? Why are we worried about cyber attacks, cyber espionage by China? Why are we just now beginning to understand the scope and the scale of China's influence in propaganda campaigns? And we have to understand history. And we have to understand that for decades, 4 decades to be precise, we engaged with China based on a hope that we would create a relationship with them that would manifestly, to the Chinese communist leadership, show that moderate liberalization, as much as we could possibly get, that engagement with the world, that upholding and even defending global norms would all be in the benefit of China, to China's benefit, as much as it would be to the benefit of the rest of the world. This was the basis for the Nixon, Kissinger, and then Carter, Brzezinski policies that opened up relations and normalized relations, and normalization came in 1979. And for those 4 decades, essentially, we pursued this path and found, to our surprise, that not only was China beginning to engage with the world after Mao, after the madness of the Cultural Revolution, the destruction of the Great Leap Forward and the Great Famine, but that economically it was becoming vastly more important than anyone could have imagined. And that's when the policy began to go in the wrong direction, because it became evident by the 1990s that China was going to play an increasingly unimaginably large role in the global economy. We let the politics become secondary. We let the moral issues become secondary. We even let the security become secondary. And what we didn't do was actually fact check ourselves. We didn't do what they call due diligence to say, okay, this is the policy we have in place now. Is it getting us to where we want to be with China? Is the policy still working in our favor? It was just assumed that, of course, it was, and that this was really the only path, this path of what you might call radical engagement, meaning never attempting to rein relations in, never attempting to impose any costs on Beijing or the Communist Party when they didn't live up to agreements or when they acted in malicious and malevolent ways. Instead, we essentially bought into the to the propaganda line of the party that the U.S. China relationship was so important, the meta relationship was so important, that you couldn't let anything upset it, right? You couldn't let little things like human rights upset it. You couldn't let little things like espionage upset it. As we moved into the 2000s and the growth of a modern Chinese military, you couldn't let things like a newly threatening and assertive military upset it. That's really where we were for almost 40 years. By 2016 in the election, it was clear to observers on both sides that policy was no longer serving American interests in the same way that it had in the beginning. Clearly, we had gotten enormous economic benefits from this relationship. China, of course, perhaps even more so, but we had gotten enormous economic benefits. But at the same time, there were great economic costs. We now faced a newly resurgent Chinese military, a modernized Chinese military. We faced the greatest espionage threat since the Soviet Union, and we faced a propaganda campaign and a human rights, anti-human rights policy on the part of China that was really forcing us to begin rethinking. This actually started in the Obama administration and continued through the campaign. Donald Trump took it in the direction that he felt was most important, starting with trade wars. Hillary Clinton undoubtedly would have done something because that first era had really come to an end. People started calling it a new Cold War, and I think it was premature to call it that in 2016, 2017. Unfortunately, I think we're a lot closer to the idea of a Cold War today, where you have two sides, and particularly a communist, a Leninist state in China that runs China, that sees itself in opposition to the rest of the world. Its documents make that very clear, whether you look at document number 9 or you look at statements at the party Congress, the important documents that come out of the plenums. Xi Jinping, who is the current general secretary of the party, is a committed Leninist. He is a committed legalist in the Chinese tradition of a powerful state. He's a committed communist, and he talks about this at the top of all of his policy pronouncements that communism with Chinese characteristics, or what they call socialism with Chinese characteristics, is in a existential battle with the West. That one system or the other will win, and that they believe it will be the Chinese communist system, and therefore they will not engage in any type of liberalization. They will not adopt any policies that could lead to greater civil society, as you saw developing somewhat in the 1990s, that undermining the position of the United States around the world, essentially discrediting liberalism and making the world safe for Chinese socialism, Chinese communism, Chinese Leninism, is the goal of the party. And these are the policies that we see. So we're in a strategic competition, as the Trump administration puts it. We're in a new era where our old suppositions about the China that would emerge has changed and has been superseded by a China that is increasingly unsupportive of these goals and these ideas that the West and the liberal West shares. That its policies are very clear as to how it will pursue this, and that we therefore have to be changing our policy. And I think that the policy that the Trump administration has adopted, the strategy that it has adopted, is one of reciprocity. And reciprocity does not mean that you cut all relations. It doesn't mean that we go to war with China. What it means, and ironically, it's actually the core of the Confucian tradition, is that you treat others as you want to be treated. It literally, word for word, almost the golden rule, that equity and fairness have to be at the basis of relationships that benefit both sides. So this Confucian ideal, what we call reciprocity, is a way of attempting to ensure that when we see actions by China that take advantage of our open societies, for example, or when they break and contravene agreements, that we act in ways to try and bring them back to a more cooperative path of engagement, that we impose costs. It does not mean, by the way, that we become like the Chinese. That's completely wrong. What it means is that we demand fairness, we demand equity, and we shape our policy, and indeed have to be bold enough to consider some level of sanctions, if you want to call them that, of reaction against China when it acts in ways that are not beneficial to us. So we're in the beginning of a new era. It's one that there is still a debate in the United States about. There's a debate around the world, but you see it happening everywhere. The EU just recently talked to China about its policies. Britain is rethinking its policies. India, of course, is rethinking its policies. The whole world is in a rethink with China. And the best thing I think we could all do would be to adopt mutually reinforcing reciprocal policies that would show Beijing that the days of a free ride, of abusing our trust, abusing our goodwill, abusing our open systems is over.
Thank you. You hit on pretty much everything that I asked about in that long series. So let me kind of build off of what I think you were hinting at, and bring in one of the contemporary concerns that I think will be of interest to many in the audience. So how has the COVID-19 pandemic reshaped our perception of China? And here, I mean, both in terms of like general public opinion, and then something that you're going to have a lot more insight into, the opinions here and the perception of the professional analyst class. And, what effect does this changed intellectual milieu have in terms of U.S. policy with regard to China? And I guess another way of asking that is, has this changed perception made previously unthinkable policies, for instance, one of the more extreme ones or radical ones, decoupling, not only thinkable now, but possible?
Well, yes, I think first of all, we were in the midst of that reassessment. It was already happening. It started happening under the Obama administration. It was clear that Beijing was taking advantage of the Obama desire to create a G2 or a reset or a strategic relationship, whatever you want to call it. Clearly, there were issues over cyber attacks. There were issues over the South China Sea. And by the end of Obama's term, I mean, relations between the United States and China were not in a good place. We just forget that because it's been superseded both by the rhetoric of the 2016 election as well as the policies that the Trump administration adopted, which went far beyond what the Obama team had contemplated, certainly in terms of trade, but also in hitting back against the cyber activities, sanctioning individuals, having individuals arrested, like the CFO of Huawei, of highlighting the influence campaigns of the Confucius Institutes and the United Front Work Department. All of this has really completely changed the nature of relations between China and the United States. But as you said, the COVID crisis that began in Wuhan, China, that was covered up by the communist regime, that was misled. The world was misled by the communist regime, that the Chinese government was secretly and quietly, not so secretly, but quietly buying up over 2.5 billion pieces of personal protective equipment to protect itself, while telling the rest of the world that it didn't have to worry about the virus, that it then shipped back, often charging inflated prices to the world defective medical equipment, defective tests, and the like, and then launched a propaganda campaign to blame the United States, to blame other countries in the world, to demand loyalty, in essence, to demand praise from weaker, more subordinate nations such as Greece and Serbia and the like over its handling of the virus that erupted in Wuhan, I think fundamentally changed the world's view of China. I don't think it's ever going to go back. First was the acknowledgement, the understanding that 95% of this could have been avoided. We'd be doing an in-person event as opposed to a webinar. 95% of this could have been avoided if Beijing had lived up to its moral and legal responsibilities to warn the world when it knew both about the disease and that it could be transmitted between humans. The cover-up means that we didn't understand how severe this was. I think the generally accepted number now in Wuhan of deaths is at least 45,000 in Wuhan alone, whereas China claimed just 88,000 cases and just over 3,000 deaths. But crowdsourcing and private information coming out of Wuhan makes it clear that over 10 times that number died in that country alone, in that city alone. And of course, we see now Beijing, parts of Beijing being back under lockdown and flights being canceled because the flare-ups mean that the country did not do as good a job as it claimed it did in eradicating this. All of this, I think, has combined to really make the world wary, as well as the fact that the world understood in a way it never had appreciated the risks of just how indebted it was. That's not the word I'm looking for. It's not the word indebted. It's dependent, how dependent we were on China for production of things like masks and gowns and medicines. We knew that China was producing lots of stuff, but we thought it was fine. We thought globalization was fine. We thought we would never have to worry about it because the markets would always operate. And then we realized that when the worst crisis in 100 years, worst health crisis in 100 years hit the world, we were at the mercy of China. We were at the mercy of Beijing. And we were not receiving the masks that we needed and the gowns that we needed and the medicines that we needed. So I think that this is a fundamental turning point, not just in the United States, but around the world. I think that the brand that the Communist Party so carefully curated over decades, whether it was win-win diplomacy, smile diplomacy, a country that was going to define and shape the future, I think that has been irreparably harmed. Now, to say that, of course, it doesn't mean that China's not important. Economically, it is, or politically. Not that it isn't a major military player and therefore a threat. Not that it still doesn't have cyber actions that are, depredations against us. All of that is true. It does not mean that we now look at China and say, well, it lied to us, so it's not important. What it has done is revealed the nature of this Leninist state, a state that cannot be truthful to its own people or the world, a state that will cover up and mislead, and quite honestly, lead to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people around the world because it could not act in a way that was responsible or representative of how a nation that is a full member of the Community of Nations acts. And I don't think you can put the, I don't know which metaphor to use. You can't put the horse back in the barn, if you want to do it that way. You can't put the spilt milk back in the bottle. The question, though, now is how does the world deal with China? That's really where we're at. It's, many people and the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation at the forefront of them had been warning about the nature of the Chinese communist regime. That, of course, didn't mean you didn't talk to it. It didn't mean you didn't do business with it. It didn't mean you didn't take students from it, but it meant you had to understand the nature of the regime. You had to understand what its goals were. We should have been clear to ourselves and honest to ourselves about the type of Leninist state we were dealing with. Now it's very clear, but the question is, what do you do? Do you onshore your productive activities so that, first of all, you can produce your own medicines? Secondly, you don't let Huawei run your 5G networks. All of these are things that are being considered, and I think you will see movement towards them. Certainly if you have, and we'd never want another outbreak like this, a pandemic like this to happen. If you have that, however, it will give even more impetus to this. So I think we are at a point, and the beginning of a point, where we are beginning just to we've done the reassessment. We've reassessed the nature of our relationship. We've reassessed the nature of the regime. Now we're in the hard part of making the policy. What should the policy look like? What is appropriate? What is prudent? What doesn't go too far? But what is not too little? It cannot be business as usual. And I expect that's going to take up an enormous amount of time of governments around the world for the next decade. In the United States, I believe it has begun with this policy of reciprocity. To say that we are not simply going to let Beijing do the types of things that it said it was going to do without our taking steps at a minimum to protect ourselves, and potentially other steps to get it to change, to shape it, as we used to say, to get it to change some of its goals. That's going to be a very difficult, risky, and fraught process, but it's going to happen around the world. And the more that liberal democracies can come together, work together, recognize the common risks that they face, then I think it's going to be better for all of them in dealing with the Communist Party of China.
So would you say then, on the basis of your immediate comments, that the ends of American policy with respect to China are actually going to be consistent? And by that I mean, our policy of engagement before was, had the assumption that they would listen to us and they would change, they would liberalize, right? That they would understand that it was in their interest, as you put it. But the net result has been that they've had more influence over us, it seems. And so is the goal still then to move China along in a more liberal direction? And to what extent can we be successful in that? Given the Leninist character of the CCP and the Chinese regime, and their own understanding that their changing is a threat to their system.
Well, I think we're in a new period of protecting ourselves, of recognizing that we are too dependent on China, that interdependence carries risks, that China has acted in bad faith. Look, you can work back. I mean, you can take some very meta issues in the relationship, which is what the National Bureau of the National Bureau of Economic Research, in a paper back, I think it was 2012, a very well-known paper, I forget the date, called The China Shock, showed that as China, once it got into the WTO and as it became more globalized and an economic player that was second only to the United States, and in some ways maybe even more important than the United States in the world, that this caused a massive hollowing out of industries around the world, but most importantly, for our concerns in the United States. So that even before you looked at questions of bad actions and bad faith on the part of Beijing, you had to look at the questions of, well, is just playing by these globalization rules the best thing for us at home? What is the offset of having lower consumer prices? Well, it's the fact that millions of Americans lost their jobs, even though then there were others who gained jobs. I mean, there was a reassessment about all of this. And then you layer onto that the question of the bad faith, the malevolence, what I think in some cases clearly is becoming a threat. And so the question then becomes not, do we engage the way that we used to, but what do you do in order to protect yourself? There's no way to decouple, as people call it, from China entirely. That doesn't work with the system that we have economically. Nor, I think, do we want a China, even though Beijing itself is in many ways drawing inwards. It looks as though it's very globalized, but the truth is, it's much harder to talk to anyone in Beijing these days. It's much harder to travel there. Certainly, they've arrested Westerners, the two Canadians, Michael Kovrig and Michael, I feel terrible, I'm forgetting his name, the second Michael, who have just been held since December of 2018 and have just been charged with spying. There are risks to the type of engagement that we have had. So no one, I think, is saying, you know what, if we just keep engaging for another 10 years, we're going to get a liberal China. That is the reassessment. We're not going to have a liberal China, certainly not under the Chinese Communist Party, not with the current Leninist legalist state that is run by Xi Jinping. So forget about the idea that you're going to have greater civil society. Forget about the idea that if you have 300,000 Chinese students per year studying in the United States, they're somehow going to go home imbued with ideas of liberalism and challenge the Chinese Communist Party. We've had decades of those students being here, and they've gone back. And if anything, the Chinese Communist Party has restricted, has squashed what little civil society there was that grew up in the 1990s. So we're not going back, to sell the same horse to the people again and say, well, let's just keep going. Now it's a question of, given the extremely successful and extremely shrewd Chinese policy, probably far more shrewd than they even anticipated, of making itself indispensable to the global economy, and of building a military that, if the United States were not in Asia, could dominate the region at whim, essentially. Now, what do we do? What do we do in order to prudently disengage, prudently decouple, so that we're not dependent on China for protective masks or medicines, for example, so that we have another 5G developer that's not Chinese, that can compete with Huawei. What do we do in order to ensure that the Chinese military doesn't simply close off the South China Sea or restrict the airways, which would have significant effects on global trade? We have to engage in a different way. We have to engage with a hard-headed approach that we need to protect our interests, and that those interests are under threat unexpectedly from a China that's become wealthier and more integrated with the world. Our expectation, again, going back, was that as it became more integrated with the world, it would become more cooperative. Instead, it is less cooperative. The reciprocity strategy is the beginning of that. I think reciprocity is very good in your initial beginning to figure out ways to protect yourself and protect your interests. And I think the administration has pursued both structural reciprocity in that it's trying to ensure that we are no longer as dependent on China for significant goods. And then there's also issue-specific reciprocity. For example, if you're only going to let in a certain number of, if you're only going to let in a certain number of American journalists, why should we then have 5 times as many Chinese journalists? What is the benefit of that? And these are very heated debates. But I think reciprocity, as it's pursued both structurally and issue-based, is something that is the initial policy rethink. After that, then you have to look longer. You have to look at that longer run and say, okay, now how are we going to deal with China over the next generation or two? What are we going to do about this? Ensuring that there's more. In fact, that there's actually more diversity within the global supply chain and the global production chain that's been so dominated by China. What do we do about cyber to ensure that there's a level cyber field and the like? So engagement itself does not end, but it's going to have to be, and I think it is already, a new kind of engagement.
Thank you. We've got some great questions that are rolling in. I just want to remind our attendees that they can submit their question for Misha using the Q&A function at any time, so throughout the event. So taking a couple of these questions and kind of rolling them together. So Taiwan represents a model of successful Chinese democracy, and as a result, it seems to pose an existential threat by its very existence to the CCP. What should the U.S. do with regard to Taiwan? More specifically, now that China has abandoned the one country, two systems with respect to Hong Kong, what do you think would be the repercussions of the U.S. abandoning the one China policy and recognizing the fact that Taiwan is an independent country? And do you think that the U.S. government would be of one mind on that, or would there be a difference between the administration and Congress?
Well, I think there's always going to be a difference of opinion within the administration. Any administration, you have those who are more concerned with military issues, those who are more concerned with economic issues, those more concerned with human rights issues. And that plays out in almost every administration. So I don't think that you're ever going to have unanimity. Ultimately, it depends on what the president wants to do. And clearly, the Trump administration has deepened relations with Taiwan far more than any other administration since normalization with the People's Republic. There is far more of a I would say, a political relationship and a recognition of the role that Taiwan plays. Clearly, they have deepened the military relationship. They are, I think, going to be deepening the economic relationship. All of this is significant, I think, because what you have is a Taiwan that has shown itself, particularly through the COVID crisis, as a country that acted as good as you can ask a country to act, both in protecting itself as well as trying to warn the rest of the world. I mean, it was very, very clear when you contrasted how China dealt, the mainland dealt with this and how Taiwan dealt with it. And I think that you're going to see increase in the U.S. engagement with China. You're going to, with Taiwan. You're going to see, I hope you'll see the rest of the world engaging more with Taiwan. It is a model for what a Chinese democracy can look like. And quite frankly, it's a model for what a democracy should look like in Asia. And we need that as well. We need it because of worrisome trends in the Philippines. We need it because of worrisome trends in Thailand. We need it because some of the older democracies, such as Japan and Korea, have other problems. And Korea, looks sclerotic and has issues, and Japan always has issues related to demographics and the like. So anyway, I hope that Taiwan becomes a beacon for Asia, but becomes a beacon when we think and talk about China as a whole. I don't think the U.S. will recognize Taiwan, and I think that's clearly a red line. And Beijing has made that very clear. But there's a lot more, and that was a historical mistake, by the way, to have let Beijing, when it was so weak and so desperate to get into the world economy and political system, to make to demand that we drop recognition of Taiwan, which really hurt the cause of democracy around the world. So I hope what we do is, I don't know exactly how to put this, is we sort of de facto normalize relations. And we have that. We have TECRO, the Taiwan Economic, Cultural and Relations Organization, representative office in Washington, D.C. It's a de facto embassy. They have de facto consulates around the country. We have got a lot more higher level of communications between the U.S. and Taiwan today. I think those should be increased. I think we should be bringing more Taiwanese students to the United States. I think there's a great deal of things that we should be doing to bring Taiwan further into the community of nations at the UN, at international organizations as well. And it's just that the world hadn't thought about doing it because it seemed that China was going to be this great opportunity, and that you wanted to make sure you were engaging with China more than Taiwan. Now I think there are countries that should begin rethinking that, and probably are beginning to rethink that carefully. But Taiwan is a model. It's a model democracy. It is a model international actor. It should be lauded as such, and it should be given every opportunity to participate internationally.
Thank you. And so kind of building off that, do you believe that if U.S. policymakers don't take decisive steps right now to prevent the consolidation of the PRC's takeover of Hong Kong, that Hong Kong could become another Tibet, something that politicians and Americans speak out against, but have become relatively comfortable with the status quo?
Yeah, this is very, very concerning. And the truth is there's little that we can do unless we're willing to really try to risk the overall relationship with China. And it's a game of blind man's bluff or chicken. How far is each side willing to go before one side backs down? Right now, China has made clear, Beijing has made clear that essentially the autonomy of Hong Kong is at an end, that the new national security law will go into effect, that the security services will be able to operate openly on Hong Kong soil. The fiction of Hong Kong being an independent country, not an independent country, but having its autonomy, it has to be sadly set aside now, and that's hard for us to get our heads around. This is what some have been warning about for a very long time, that Beijing would make that move on Hong Kong, and it would see how the world would react. And then it may make that move on Taiwan, because the world didn't react in the beginning. In some ways, it might have been the Uyghurs that were the canary in the coal mine. The fact that you could basically put into concentration camp prisons 1 million or more Uyghurs, and the world did nothing. The Arab world did nothing. The liberal world did nothing. And Beijing learns from that. They learn very well, what is possible and what's not possible. We've learned to push back in certain ways, not over things like Hong Kong and human rights, but on certain things related to security issues, South China Sea. But at the end of the day, it hasn't really deterred Beijing. They've built islands and they've militarized them. They've continued cyber attacks. And so when it comes to Hong Kong, they've learned that there's no cost. It would have been easy to impose costs on Beijing back in 1980 or 1990. And that's probably why they didn't try these things. They try it when they're stronger, much, much stronger. And then the risk for us is much, much greater. The Trump administration is correct in announcing that it will change some of the preferential treatment that Hong Kong gets. It should, unfortunately, for the most part, be treated now as part of the mainland. I think we should be offering the West, the liberal West, liberal nations, should be offering asylum to civil society figures in Hong Kong. We should be replicating Hong Kong civil society outside of Hong Kong, because it's very uncertain whether that will be able to continue. We should allow educators, we should allow religious figures, we should allow people of faith, we should allow business leaders, we should allow those with alternate lifestyles, all things that are not allowed in China, mainland China, by the Communist Party, to thrive in the West. That civil society should be welcomed. And it is a heartbreaking historical moment, but we can't shrink from it and pretend that it's not serious and pretend that nothing's going to change. And one of the biggest problems we have is with the corporations that in this particular case, like HSBC, signed on to it and said, sure, no problem with the security law. Western and American corporations that kowtow to the communist Chinese when they are told, they are ordered to apologize for offending the Chinese people because they list Taiwan as an independent country, or they list Hong Kong, or they pull up a quote from the Dalai Lama, whatever it is. This goes back to the beginning of our trading relations with China, where the merchants did not care about the indignities that were heaped upon them back then by the Qing dynasty, and now with the communist Leninist state. We have a big problem with these corporations. They are abetting what the Communist Party is doing, what the Leninist state is able to do. And we need to somehow get to a new point where these corporations learn not to self-censor, where they learn not to abet what the Leninist state is doing by giving it technology, for example, that it can use to further oppress its own people. This is a moral issue and it's a security issue. And quite frankly, given the trillions of dollars that China has stolen in intellectual property rights from the rest of the world, it's an economic issue.
Thank you. You mentioned that the Uyghurs might have been the red line or the tripwire that didn't go off, that allowed the CCP to understand that they could move forward. Do you have an opinion on John Bolton's accusations about Trump's giving a tacit nod to Xi Jinping on this? And also, do you think that the recently passed and signed Uyghur Human Rights Act is going to allow the U.S. to actually maybe make a difference in Xinjiang?
Well, I haven't read Bolton's book, and I wasn't in the room, and I understand that for some of his claims, he wasn't in the room either, so I don't know. It's been disputed by others. It's been disputed by those who were involved. I see the administration as having a strategy. He calls, he calls the Trump administration's policy chaotic and incoherent, with no philosophy, no grand strategy, and no policy. Those are his words. I see that there is a strategy. Now, strategies are just that. They have to be implemented. And any strategy is never 100% implemented. And there has been back and forth. It's interesting to me. I think without defending the Trump administration, I mean, I'm not part of it, but if this were a different administration and we saw that it sort of went back and forth, made a statement, gave time for the Chinese to react, imposed a certain level of sanctions, for example, in the trade wars, and then imposed another level and another level. Said we're not going to let Huawei in, and then we're going to relax a little bit on ZTE, and then so anyway, I think a lot of people would say this is a wonderful strategy. It's not too doctrinaire. It's not too rigid. It doesn't go overboard. It doesn't go all the way to 11 right away. It doesn't make people fear that you're going to get into a war. And instead, they're doing it in measured steps that have now taken 3.5 years. But the administration is charged with being incoherent and chaotic. I think a lot of it's in the eye of the beholder. I think they have a strategy of reciprocity that is very clear. They have a national security strategy, which states that it's a competitive relationship. They have a new strategic approach to the People's Republic of China that talks about reciprocity, and Secretary of State Pompeo has explicitly said we seek reciprocity. So I think, to me, it seems fairly clear what they're trying to do. They certainly don't hit a home run every time, and sometimes you have to walk back a little bit, because everyone does that. I mean, if you look at the Obama administration and you look at the claims that it made for the pivot and what it was supposed to do and what it ultimately did, that was a policy that certainly didn't seem to have an overall strategy to it, but it was rhetorically. Everyone appreciated it rhetorically because they were happy to hear that the United States was stressing the Asia Pacific. So anyway, I don't know the veracity of Bolton's claims, but I do think that the administration has tried to do something very difficult. It has tried to change 40 years of policy, and again, some of that started in the Obama era, but a real full rethink, as I was talking about, reassessment and then recrafting of policy is not an easy thing. It's not something that just happens overnight, especially when you've had an entire generation behind it. So I think we have to wait and see how it develops. We have to see if Trump is not reelected, then what happens to the policy? Does it go back if Biden's reelected? Can you snap back to the way it was? I'm not sure you can do that so easily, and certainly given what's happened with the virus, or if Trump is reelected, how much further do they pursue it? There are risks to it. Of course, there are risks, and some of it flies against our own beliefs in how we should be as a people, an open society, that we want people to come here. And now are you saying, well, we don't want Chinese graduate students because they can be security risks? But because of the actions of the party, these are things we are forced to confront. So I think we're just in the foothills of this. Well, we haven't reached the peak now of saying what America's second generation China policy is going to be. We're in the foothills of trying to figure out the shape and the contour and the best way to climb the mountain so that you actually get to the peak.
So one of the interesting areas where we have to do some of this rethinking is actually in the media. So what would a policy of reciprocity involving the media look like? Because currently, the Global Times, Xinhua, CCP officials, Chinese diplomats, I mean, they're on our social media feed. They're bombarding us with Chinese propaganda. The China Times is published as an insert in the Washington Post, and that's a paid-for advertisement by the CCP. And yet, American media is not given access to the Chinese internet. We're not able to beam our content without any restrictions, and we can't communicate directly with the Chinese people. And so how might we leverage this idea of reciprocity in the media?
Yeah, well, I think it's a very good question. It goes to questions of the influence campaign, the propaganda campaigns. You have to, I think, extend it ultimately to the Confucius Institutes, the United Front Work Department. The Trump administration has started. It announced that it would reduce the numbers of Chinese journalists that are allowed in the United States. And a lot of people have in here in the States have pushed back against that. They think it's a bad idea. And you're right, there are these paid advertisements. Twitter, I think last week, just I forget how many thousands of accounts it deactivated that were clearly Chinese bot accounts or Chinese accounts that were designed just to spread. I don't understand a lot of this Twitter stuff, so I don't really know how these bot accounts work. But anyway, they suspended thousands of them. So I think, first of all, there is the beginning again of this pushback, and I don't know if maybe the insert, I don't get the paper, so I don't know if the inserts are still in there or not. And Confucius Institutes are being closed in part because the government said to the schools, if you get U.S. government money, you can't have a Confucius Institute, which I think is the right thing. At one point, when you look at the different types of institutes and what they called Confucius classrooms that they had, there were 600 of them in the United States, all told, and we had only 20 American centers, which were barely American centers, open in China, and all of those were closed very quickly, back in the Obama years, in fact. So it was a completely unfair playing field, and it shouldn't be allowed. I mean, and that is where it goes back to what I said about our sense of ourselves as an open society. We want to be an open society, but you can't be an open society in a way that brings harm to yourself by a malevolent foreign actor in this case. And so we don't like doing these things. We don't like saying, as the Trump administration said last week, that it was going to not renew the visas of anyone connected to the Chinese military schools. But I think that's completely right. Why would we have serving military figures from officers from China in our top research institutes? That makes no sense, I think, to a lot of Americans. The media is one where people really get upset about it. They're saying, well, you do nothing by cutting off the Chinese media's access to the United States. And yet, I think that's a valid claim only if what the Chinese media is reporting is accurate, which clearly it's not. It's all censored. And the Global Times is just a propaganda mouthpiece. So I don't see exactly why we think that having 500 or 1,000 or however many Chinese reporters makes any difference here. Some of them may well be espionage agents, who knows? But the point is that they can't report what's actually happening in the country. So number one, why have such vast numbers? And number two, as you said, if you only got 100 American reporters, or however many it is in China, I think it's fewer than that. Why is that fair? And you're right, and our reporters are not allowed to go anywhere in China. They're not allowed to just travel freely. Sometimes they manage, but they can't travel simply the way that the Chinese do here. That's reciprocity. It's uncomfortable for us. But you know what? We have to get over the fact that it's uncomfortable. And we have to recognize that it is going, hopefully, first of all, to protect some of our interests. And secondly, may, in the best of all worlds, force Beijing and the party state to realize that it can't simply have its own way, that it has to act in ways that are beneficial to both sides.
Thank you. So asking about something that's happening today, or happened a little earlier, what are the implications of today's Beidou satellite launch and China's independence from the American GPS system? And how should the U.S. respond to the increasing Chinese presence in space?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's more detailed than I actually know. I'm not a specialist in this. I think that though, when you look at China setting up its own GPS system, it has to be seen in the context of sometimes what's called the splinternet, in the sense that China's developing its own digital infrastructure. It's certainly done so at home, but it's now trying to extricate itself, first on one hand, extricate itself from any reliance on outside sources, which, quite honestly, I understand. We wouldn't want to rely, even though in some cases we do, on Chinese satellites or the satellites of any other country. So it's not surprising to me that any country, but let alone a country like an authoritarian country, doesn't want to rely on GPS that could be jammed or denied at an important point. But then secondarily, what it's also doing is trying to spread its systems around the world, right? So it may be offering its GPS to other countries, and that would tie them into a digital infrastructure, a communications infrastructure that is not always going to be in their best interest. Same thing with 5G. So what we have to recognize is that, again, for the first time, even more than what the Soviet Union was able to do, we face a global competitor, who can, in many ways, separate itself from our systems that we set up, the global systems, telecommunication systems, digital systems, and the like. We're actually testing the degree to which it can be separated from the global economy because of the pandemic, both sanctions with the trade war, as well as the restrictions that have been placed on trade and the general collapse in global demand. So we're sort of testing how well the Chinese economy can do when it doesn't have the world is not its purchaser of all of its goods. And clearly the economy is in trouble. We know that. I mean, we know that it's weakening. And so I think you have to look at the satellite launch and the GPS system sort of in that sense. It's going to make their military better. It's going to make them potentially a security partner. I mean, they don't really have many partners, but they're going to be able to offer Pakistan this data. They're going to be able to offer North Korea, if they wish, this data. And there'll be some other countries as well. Once you start having them in, for example, Europe, where they might, because of the debt that Greece has, force Greece onto that grid, you have to start getting worried. Now, that being said, since we're all here in Washington, the more satellites that China puts up and the more that it becomes dependent on those satellites, the better it is for the U.S. Because in a time of war, we'd be able to take those satellites out. Unfortunately, they can take ours out. So again, we're getting into a mutual assured destruction in space, which is not a good thing. But the fact is, China has already been perfecting anti-satellite capability. We're going to have to get at that point. It's a little analogous, I would say, in the security realm, if we want to think about it from that perspective, to the islands in the South China Sea. Everyone's gotten very concerned about these islands that have been militarized. And that's true. In a steady state environment, they make it very easy for China to dominate the South China Sea. On the other hand, they're incredibly vulnerable. And so, the U.S. military would just have some more targets to look at. If God forbid we got into a shooting war, they would have targets to look at, just as they would have targets in space. The problem there is that you keep inching towards these what ifs. Well, what if we had to take out the satellites? What if we had to take out the islands? All of that's indicative of the fact that the relationship has gone in a completely different direction from what we expected. All of these choices were freely made choices on the part of Beijing. It didn't have to develop anti-satellite technology. Why? What was the threat? The United States wanted it integrated into this global system. We've been upholding freedom of navigation in the world's oceans and the South China Sea for 70 years. Why did it have to build islands and militarize them? We have to start asking the why question. There's the who benefits question, and then there's the why question. Why has Beijing taken these actions when it faced, if anything, an America that was bending over backwards to integrate it into the world economy? And I think the answer goes to the worldview and the nature of the Leninist state. They have told us how they view the world. They have told us how they view capitalism. We have to take them seriously and at their words. And then it's a long road, but you can extend that all the way to where we are by saying, well, they're going to have their own GPS system that's going to make their military much more globally effective. What does that mean for us? Well, it means that we have almost a peer challenger, and we're going to have to get very smart about that. At the same time, we're going to have to, and this is where I think reciprocity is important, early on. I mean, in some ways the hour is late, but early on, make clear to China that there are costs for disruptive action, and that you don't want to go down this road because it is going to be bad for you, bad for the party, bad for the world. The reciprocity policy is a belated recognition, a belated attempt to start that. We should have started it several decades ago. And so we are playing catch up, but at least we're beginning it now.
Thank you. So you mentioned the struggling Chinese economy. A lot of the CCP's political legitimacy has been tied to being able to deliver basically double-digit economic growth year after year. In the last couple of years, they have not been able to do that. How do you have any data at all of how the Chinese people are currently seeing the party? And is there a chance that if the economic stagnation continues, that they will actually lose their what legitimacy they actually have?
That's a great question. It also raises the really hard question about how much do we actually know of what's going on in China? Is it a black box to us? Do we really know what Xi Jinping is saying behind closed doors? The answer is no, of course not. And so it's hard to rely only on translated documents. That's what they're willing to let out. We don't have good understanding of how to gauge public opinion through the internet. We get fragmentary pieces of it. A lot has actually come out from Wuhan, came out during the pandemic and afterwards, that showed that it was not the picture that the Chinese Communist Party was portraying. But how do we know how much dissent there is? If there are almost 1 billion users of the internet in China, and they're using Weibo, and they're using these WeChat and these other platforms, we don't have access to them. That's the great firewall that has been set up. That's the splinternet. We know there's been criticism. There's been growing criticism of Xi Jinping. The constitutional scholar Xu Zhangrun, who was a professor at Tsinghua, I believe it was Tsinghua, who was suspended from teaching after he called on Xi to resign, and then I believe was put under house arrest, has disappeared. Other businessmen have disappeared. There was the blogger Fang Fang, I think her name was, who was blogging from Wuhan. We know that there are voices that are out there, and it should be that we think of the internet as a great leveler. The way we looked at sort of samizdat photocopying in Eastern Europe before the fall of the color revolutions and the fall of communism there. But China's much better at controlling the internet. They're much better at shutting down VPNs, and they have trouble. I mean, they face microblogging and the VPNs and things that make it hard to control, and yet overall they're very sophisticated, and they put enormous amount of energy into it. And they haven't given up in a way that basically the Soviets had already given up. So I don't think we're ever going to really know. We will always have a fragmented picture. The best we can do is try to piece it together and give voice or give space to those voices that are calling for change, that want to warn us about what's actually happening. We need to embrace them, and we do have technology that can help, but it's far from perfect.
Thank you. One last question. What's going on at the Chinese-Indian border, and what are the stakes that are at play?
Well, this is, so there is a long series of border disputes between China and India. Some of them go back to the 19th century in Bhutan. This is what's in an area in between the two countries known as the line of actual control from the 1962 war, and each side has always maintained its own interpretation of legitimacy of the line and pushing forward, whether it's detachments that go across the line back and forth. In this case, the Indians claim that the Chinese were building structures on their side of the line, and then I think the Chinese claim the Indians were doing the same thing. And you had something like 600 soldiers up way high up in the Himalayas, battling throughout the night. At least 20 Indian soldiers. 20 Indian soldiers were killed, and an unknown number of Chinese. You assume there had to be some Chinese killed. They were battling each other, not with guns, because they moved guns out of the disputed area precisely because of tensions like this. And so they were beating each other with sticks and pipe rods and stones. I mean, it was almost medieval hand-to-hand. It was hand-to-hand combat. It looked for a while, as these things always do, that it would spiral out of control, and then both sides backed off. But it's indicative of the problems that China has with many of its neighbors. It's not just in the South China Sea. It's not just with Japan. It's with India as well. It's with the nations of Southeast Asia. In the long run, I think it's with Russia, though today you have Putin and Xi being allies, so to speak. China actually, under Xi Jinping, Beijing has problems all around its periphery. He's caused, through his assertive and aggressive actions, a reaction on the part of many nations, and it is not what Beijing wants to see. And that's also, by the way, we were just talking about criticism of Xi Jinping. That is actually some of the criticism, that he's putting China into a far worse position with all of its neighbors. And so this is something to keep watching. The actions that Japan's taking to protect the Senkakus. The Philippines is moving hesitantly back towards the United States after flirting with Beijing. Vietnam, of course, has very fraught relations. All of this is clear that China is not being seen as either an accepted hegemon, an unthreatening power in the region, or as an unalloyed force for good. Instead, the nations in the region are waking up to the nature of the Chinese threat when China is unwilling to peacefully resolve disputes like this or continue to press its claims. And so this is just one indication of a whole host of problems that Beijing has. In this case, it's very serious. You have two nuclear armed powers that fought a pretty major war only 50 years ago, 60 years ago, that have not been able to solve it in 60 years, and therefore are teetering again towards, 20 soldiers getting killed is a pretty big number, but they are teetering towards one real mistake into potentially all-out conflict.
Well, thank you very much, Misha, not only for joining us, but also for your ongoing work to help us understand what's going on in Asia and what we can do about it. I remind our audience that Misha's latest book, Asia's New Geopolitics, Essays on Reshaping the Indo-Pacific, is now available. I know that you'll learn a lot. It's a wide-ranging book, nice collection of essays. Very much recommend. You can find more information about VOC's upcoming events and the work of our China Studies team at victimsofcommunism.org. You can also follow our work on Facebook and Twitter at VO Communism. For the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, I'm Murray Bissett. Thank you all again for attending, and have a great day.